Welcome to Think Tech Talks. I'm Jay Fidell. Today we're going to talk with Elizabeth Cline. She's a reporter for The Nation. She joins us by Skype from Brooklyn, New York. She's going to talk to us about fashion because she wrote an article for The Nation about fashion, and we're calling this show Fashion Goes Local. Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Jay. It's good to be on the show.
Tell us a little about The Nation so we understand what it is.
Okay, sure. The Nation is a weekly news magazine that focuses pretty heavily on labor issues, and that's why I ended up contributing this story about the renaissance of apparel manufacturing in New York City. I mean, everybody knows that New York City is a fashion capital, but it hasn't been a garment manufacturing hub in several decades. So I wanted to write about that for The Nation, but I'm also an author of a book called Overdress, The Shockingly High Cost of Cheap Fashion. So I write a lot about issues related to labor and outsourcing and just the economics and politics of the fashion industry.
Wow, how did you get into that, Elizabeth? That's not an ordinary beat, you know.
Yeah, you know what it was? Maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I consider myself to be somewhat of a conscious consumer. I think a lot of people try to make efforts in their lives to eat right and, try and buy environmentally friendly products when they can, but I wasn't seeing that same level of consciousness in fashion. And just personally, I owned over 350 items of clothing, and I don't even identify as someone who's really into fashion or clothes. I just had all this clothing because clothes are so cheap and they're everywhere. Yeah. And, everybody just gets seduced into this sort of buy and toss logic when it comes to fashion. And I wanted to know how these companies, how these retailers do what they do, and what had changed in consumer psychology that made us think that it was okay to, buy clothes for the weekend and never wear them after, once or twice. So that was really the idea. It really came from my own shopping habits.
Yeah, well, that's great. You must be a great shopper. And, being a shopper in New York is like being in paradise. Everywhere you go, every shop, everywhere. And they're competitive, so you can find bargains everywhere, too. It must be a great way to spend time, actually.
Well, since writing the book, I definitely have tried. I've changed the way that I shop tremendously. I shop a lot less, and I try to buy things, back to the topic of this Nation article. I really am a huge advocate for domestically produced clothing. I think in general it tends to be better made. There's a higher level of craftsmanship, and I like supporting my local economy. So yeah, that's changed a lot in my life in the last couple of years.
Well, take a look at the history for a minute. I think it was very local in the 19th century, and in the beginning of the 20th century. I remember all those factories down around 14th Street, was it? And they were manufacturing everything. And I don't know if you remember, but the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was an example of how, right. Cheap labor was abused in those days. But, gradually it went elsewhere. It went to the South. It went to factories in other places in the country and then other places in the world. And I guess a part of this whole discussion is that New York at some point lost it. It was cheaper to manufacture clothing in Cambodia, so that's where it went. Yeah. So what's the historical track of that?
Well, I would say as late as the 1960s, still the vast majority of clothing was being manufactured in the United States, and New York still was manufacturing over half of that, probably well over half of that. And I would say that it wasn't really until the 1990s. So job loss started slowly in the 1970s. Before that, it started moving south in the 40s and 50s. Then in the 70s is when it started to move to places like Hong Kong and Taiwan. And then we saw, moving into the 90s, after the North American Free Trade Agreement was passed, that's when we really saw just the total devastation of the textile and apparel industries, where, it went from maybe 80,000 textile and apparel jobs in New York City down to where we're at today, which I think is somewhere around maybe like, I don't want to misquote this, but maybe around 10 to 20,000. And yeah, and then of course, China is really the leader now. That's where the majority of clothing purchased in the United States is made today.
Scary, you know, how everything we use, even the clothes on our backs, manufactured in China or around China. But now what happened? Something happened in New York. You're putting your finger on a sea change of significant importance. What happened and why?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's very sexy to talk about free trade deals, but like that was a big part of it. You know, before starting in the 1970s, there were quotas that protected our textile and apparel industry. So even if a country on the other side of the world had cheaper labor, they could only export a certain number of garments to the United States, and then those sort of protectionist measures slowly went away until they were completely eliminated in 2005. So a lot of it has to do with that. A lot of it has to do with globalization. You know, like, yes, China has very cheap factories, but, you know, China wouldn't be able to do what they do without the internet and without, you know, the ability to Skype with factories in China. It's like designers and factories and retailers are so interconnected now because of telecommunications. So that's a big part of it as well. Yeah. Because I mean, the cost of labor in New York in terms of garment labor hasn't really gone up. It's stalled out because there aren't even unionized garment workers here anymore. So it's not that our cost of labor has gone up, it's that we have more access to cheap labor around the world.
So now there's been something happening in New York, which you have put your finger on, and I'm really impressed with them, because, you know, a true sea change is something you don't notice, and then somebody like Elizabeth Cline comes around and she notices it for you and she writes it and you say, aha, yes, true.
Yeah.
So what did you notice, and when, and how did it present itself?
Well, I would say that there have been rumblings for the past. So my book Overdressed came out in 2012, and at that point I thought, well, you know, we're never going to see more than a small percentage of apparel manufacturing in the United States ever again. But, you know, I keep in touch with people in the industry, and I just started to hear that Made in America, first of all, the concept was taking hold with consumers once again. So that was end of 2012 into 2013. And then I think what really tipped consumers into supporting this movement full scale was when, if you'll recall, in April of 2013, a garment factory collapsed in Bangladesh, and it killed over 1,000 people, and that factory was producing clothes for Western brands. So I think that was a real watershed moment where people were saying, we want an alternative. We would like to support clothes made in the United States. We would like to support clothes made locally, simply because it's easier to keep track of things like labor abuses.
And yet you look at patriotism too.
Yeah. Absolutely. And we certainly need that. You know, we're still coming out of a recession. Most of the job growth during the recession has been in low-paying jobs. So, of course, people want to support the return of manufacturing jobs and not more low-paid retail and service industry jobs. So what started as anecdotal little stories being passed around at parties and meetings and networking events has become an actual tangible, you know, quantifiable shift in New York, where there are new factories opening back up. There are new garment jobs being created, which is just incredible.
I'm always interested in exactly how new businesses are organized. You know, there's essential elements like money, capital, there's entrepreneurial spirit, there's some bright idea, there's usually some sort of collaboration between people of like mind. You know, who is coming back to this, and why, and what kind of capital are they using, and where are they getting the labor? You got a minute for that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so exciting because the industry doesn't look like it used to. I mean, if you think about garment factories from mid-century, they were huge. They had massive footprints. They made large orders for the mass market. And what we're seeing now is independent designers sharing resources in this space. So there's this new organization in New York City called Manufacture New York, and they're going to open this 160,000 square foot facility out in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, and they're going to have more than 30 different separate private manufacturers of apparel, home furnishings, mostly apparel, all in one space. And what happens when people come together and are able to share manufacturing resources, it brings the cost down for everyone involved. And I think that there's also a real emphasis on, as I was saying earlier, on quality and craftsmanship. This isn't the kind of clothing that you can buy in Walmart or H&M and Target. They're offering consumers a real alternative instead of just more of the same throwaway stuff that they can buy at a chain store.
That's fantastic. You know, I mean, the whole idea of coming back, but then coming back in a different form and coming back with different products and new levels of innovation and creativity. It's like, you know, the phoenix bird rising from the ashes, but better. This is a wonderful thing. You know, and maybe it speaks more than just the fashion industry. Maybe it speaks of this New York thing, the post 9/11 thing, where people really care about being in the city. They're proud of it. You know, they want it to be the best place in the world, and they are achieving that.
I think it goes deeper than that. I think that, you know, people are talking about this idea of manufacturing 2.0. Manufacturing is not going to look like it did 100 years ago, 50 years ago, even 20 years ago. In order for the United States to be competitive, we have to use more technology, more skilled workers. We have to be more innovative in order to compete, because there are people, you know, producing stuff all around the world, and we have to produce something better because we don't have the cheapest labor in the world, nor do we want to have the cheapest labor in the world. So that's something that I'm really excited about, is how we reinvent manufacturing to stay competitive. And it's happening in fashion, and it's happening in many other sectors as well.
So if I walked into a garment manufacturing factory, say the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in 1905, I would see rows and rows of, you know, I think it was right near 14th Street, as a matter of fact. 14th and Broadway, I think. And I can still visualize the women jumping out of the windows and so forth. That, you know, that made such a difference in American labor, that one event. It changed Tammany Hall. It changed the press. It changed the way people looked at labor, and young labor especially. Anyway, so, you know, it strikes me, if you looked at that factory, you would see rows and rows of sewing machines. You would see the selvage on the floor. You know, you would see all kinds of, you know, the difficult working conditions and so forth. Now you come and you see people with a little training. You see people with high-tech equipment. You see the factory is broken down into functionality. I'm saying this because I recently toured one, and it doesn't have a lot of sewing machines so much as machines that will prepare, you know, the fabricated pieces for sewing. Right? I mean, describe one of these factories. What does it look like?
Well, in some ways, garment factories never change. The reason why clothing is so it's so labor intensive. So to some degree, you still have to have people behind sewing machines. But there's also now the advent of 3D printing machines. So these are machines that have the ability to you know, take a pattern and print out fabric, which is it's huge. And, you know, you have pop stars like Lady Gaga wearing 3D printed materials. And so that's going to be a big thing in the future. And I think that, you know, things like knitwear and is becoming more automated. Embroidery is becoming more automated. There are also more high-end designers. The types of dyes that are used, the process of dyeing clothes is changing a lot. So if you walk into a factory, there's a lot more collaboration you know, you don't just see rows and rows of people working. It's a designer talking to a sewing machine operator. The factories are smaller, the machines are more varied, they're slightly more advanced. But yeah, I think it's more of a qualitative difference in that you do have designers and workers partnering to create a better product, which I think is really cool.
So, Elizabeth, you know, customarily we take a break at 15 after the hour, and then 30, and then 40. So we have to make a choice here about whether we want to wrap it up or go forward and do a full 50-minute discussion with you. I assure you I have questions that will keep you going for 50 minutes. If you have the time, we'll do that.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, let's take a short break. We'll be right back after this break. This is Think Tech Talks in Honolulu. Castle & Cooke, Hawaii. Investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state. Collateral Analytics, empowering the real estate industry to make better informed property investment decisions. The Foreign Trade Zone, bringing the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone programs to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. Galen Ho, a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company. Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island. The Hawaii Energy Policy Forum, incorporating diverse perspectives to design a flexible and forward-looking energy strategy. Hawaii Energy, the state's energy and efficiency program created to help Hawaii's residents and businesses adopt a clean energy lifestyle. Hawaii Gas, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future. Hawaii Pacific Health, bringing technology and teamwork together to transform healthcare in Hawaii. The High Tech Development Corporation, attached to DBED, is the state's leading technology agency. The SHIDLER Family Foundation, supporting educational, cultural, and charitable organizations, including Think Tech. Okay, we're back. Think Tech Talks. This is Jay Fidell. We're talking about fashion and how it goes local, or maybe beyond that, with Elizabeth Cline. She's a reporter for The Nation, and she wrote an article recently about fashion in New York City, and not too long ago, a book called Overdraft, also about fashion. And we've been talking about the changes in New York City and how the fashion industry is reemerging, or at least the manufacturing side. But Elizabeth, I wanted to sort of connect up the dots you've been talking about and ask you how it all sort of comes together in the new iteration of fashion in New York. For example, the connection between the manufacturing people and the fashion designer people. Sounds to me like they're sitting in each other's laps now. It's different now, yeah?
Well, the model, sorry there.
Yeah.
Had a little technical difficulty. The model that I'm describing, where you have designers and manufacturers working in the same space, it's a very new idea. I would say I could list off 3 examples in New York City where it's a total reinvention, where and one of them, okay, so there's this one high-end designer in New York City named Nanette Lepore, and she's a contemporary women's wear designer. And when she's designing her collection for the runway, as she just did for the fall 2014 show, it actually showed last week in New York City, she has a design and manufacturing studio in her headquarters. So what that means is as an idea develops, instead of making a sketch and a pattern and a sample and sending it off to China to have produced there and having the samples sent back to New York, she has her own team of pattern makers, sample sewers, cutters. She still has a hand sewer, which is almost unheard of in New York City for anyone to actually hire someone that sits down and sews beads and embroidery onto clothing. And it's a very collaborative process because a pattern maker is basically an engineer of clothing. So you can have a great idea about how a dress fits together, but it's going to be your pattern maker that really figures out if that clothing is going to fit together on the human body and fit in a way that where you can still move and that it flatters your form. Pratt University, which is a Brooklyn-based
Sure,
university.
it's a technical school, isn't it? It's an engineering school, yeah.
Yeah, an art engineering school, and they also have a great fashion program. So they've started something called the Brooklyn Fashion and Design Accelerator, and they're working on getting a space right now so they can open. And it's going to be the same sort of situation where they're going to have a couple dozen fashion designers and also have the cut and sew facility in the same space, so those designers have access to manufacturing resources, but they also have access to dye labs, to 3D printing machines, as I was talking about earlier. And Pratt is working with local job placement organizations to help train people to run the 3D printers. So it's great for job creation, and then it's also great for innovation and fashion as well.
Well, I guess we got to make a distinction because, you know, what you described sounds like, to me, the model of the future. This is the way fashion is going to be done, where everybody together in one space and they can talk to each other. It's brilliant. It's like the way the technology industry, you know, got started years ago.
Yeah.
But what strikes me is that there's got to be a line somewhere between what you describe and fashion, clothing, forget fashion, clothing for the masses. Where is that line? How can we find that line?
That's a really good question. I think that line, even in the model I was just describing, kind of exists naturally, because it's like once you get your, honestly, it's really similar to technology. Like imagine when you're prototyping a new smartphone or a new piece of wearable technology, the prototype is where all the innovation happens. And once that product is up and going and it's ready to be mass manufactured, that's when it would just go to a factory in China. Mm-hmm. In fashion, what would happen is, let's say one of these brands, one of these fashion designers who comes out of the Pratt Accelerator grows into a multi-million-dollar brand, which we want that to happen. We want these companies to get bigger, because that's when they can start employing more people. And if they get to the point where they just need, 2,000 units of a really popular shirt, 5,000 units of a really popular pant that they did, you're not going to produce that in this, high-end, high-tech factory necessarily. You're still going to want to call that factory in the garment district and, on 38th Street in New York City and say, hey, what's the lowest price you can produce this pant for? Like that side of the factory, production is not going to go away. And I think that that's a good thing. We need, we do need these sort of high-skilled, high-paying manufacturing jobs, but we also need, the mass manufactured part of it to a certain extent in the United States as well.
Yeah, but that leads to another question, another what I call a rhetorical digression, sorry. And that is how this affects, let's talk about women, because I don't think men they're interested but not quite as interested in fashion. How does this change, vis-a-vis the life of the woman of the world? The women of the world. In other words, if fashion is easier now, or becoming easier now, then presumably more women can have the benefit of whatever fashion is offering in terms of identification, in terms of the way they look, the way they conduct themselves, their access to business and, other achievements. Fashion is more than just a clothes on your back. It's a statement of who you are, and it is a tool by which you can live your life. So am I right to say that this new model we're talking about, with everything rolled into one space, like in Prospect Park, that actually will extend to many more women than fashion has ever extended before?
Well, some people say that we're living in the era of democratic fashion because of retailers like H&M, Forever 21, Zara, who make cheap knockoffs of runway styles, that pretty much anyone can afford. But I think that what we're going to start moving towards you know, with this domestic model that I'm talking about, one thing that's really interesting about it and really important about it is speed to market. You know, fashion cycles are so much quicker today, and a lot of that has to do with the internet. You know, if a celebrity is on a talk show or makes an appearance on a red carpet and that style becomes a trend, well, if you place an order for that trend in China, it's going to take you several months to get that item onto shelves. Whereas the local model is much quicker. It's weeks. In New York, if you want to, you can go to design to finished product in a matter of weeks. The other thing about it is it's so much less wasteful. When you're ordering out of China, the lead times are so long, and oftentimes you over order because you're not really sure what's going to sell and you want to make sure you have enough product. Whereas when you're producing locally, it's much more of a made to order feel. And I think the other thing that really changes the consumer attitude, the fashion consumer, is when you know the designer who makes your clothes, and you're able to, say, tour the factory, which is like a huge bone of some of these models opening in New York City, like Manufacture New York and the Brooklyn Fashion Design and Accelerator. That gives you a connection to your clothes that we're really missing right now. You know, like, people don't keep something that they buy from H&M because they have no emotional connection to it whatsoever. Whereas that really changes if you can meet the designer who makes your clothes, you can tour their factory, and you know something about the origins of what you're buying.
Yeah, it's a work of art, and it's a work of art that you have, you know, personally participated in somehow by selecting it, by having your own taste, applying your taste to what's available, being part of the process. I mean, it's a great experience. So, I mean, I can understand why people get excited about it, and why they're excited about it now, and especially now. But, you know, going back to the main thread of this, the backbone of it, so to speak, in New York, you've seen this renaissance. I think you called that in your article, yeah? Renaissance, wasn't it? Anyway, who's there? Who are the entrepreneurs? Did they go to school for this? Did it dawn on them that? Did they read your article and decide they want to be entrepreneurs? What made them decide to get into this? I mean, it's not like you're born to do fashion. You have to find it. How did they find it?
Well, I mean, honestly, that's a question there's so many different stories, but I can tell you about some of the characters that I wrote about in the Nation article. The CEO of Manufacture New York, which is, you know, they've opened a pilot program in the Garment Center, and they're going to open a 160,000 square foot facility in Sunset Park. Their CEO, her name is Bob Bland, and she's a former independent fashion designer who was extremely frustrated by how difficult it was to produce her line in the United States. And she simply saw a demand for American-made clothing and a lack of resources for independent designers, and she decided to fix that problem. And there are many, many people involved in that project now beyond her, but it really came out of, you know, the problem-solving entrepreneurial spirit of an independent designer. With the Pratt Accelerator, that I believe is the brainchild of Deb Johnson, who is an educator at Pratt University, and she also started the Pratt Design Incubator back in 2002, which is devoted to design startups. It can be not specific to fashion. So, you know, like she's helped launch like clean tech businesses, for example. And she's very interested in sustainability. So how do we create new fashion businesses in New York City that are local, affordable, on trend, innovative, but also, you know, take the environment in mind as well. And then the third person I can think of that I want to mention is Joanne Kim, who just came on as the sales and marketing director about a year ago at her father's factory, Johnny's, in the garment district. So her father has been in the industry for 3 decades. And I'm sure you can imagine most people in my generation and younger are not saying, yay, I want to work in a garment factory. But this has really changed in the last year or two, where people are saying, you know what, this is a good line of work, and there's space for reinvention. I think she had like a degree in art and literature or something, but
yeah,
you know, she jumped around from job to job, and she was like, you know what, there are all these designers who suddenly want to make clothes in New York City. I'm going to work with my dad, and I'm going to use Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and use my sales and marketing skills to connect with this new generation of designers.
Wow, that's a great story. I mean, that's the story I was looking for. That one where you your life is in this direction, and all of a sudden you change it to that direction and get on board something that turns you on.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's take a short break, a second break, if you don't mind, Elizabeth. That's Elizabeth Cline. She's a reporter for the Nation, writes in New York, writes about fashion in New York. Very exciting to hear talk about it. We're talking about fashion goes local, you know, but maybe fashion in some ways is going global, and we'll get into that some more after this break.
I'm Hong Jiang, host for Asia in Review on Tuesdays.
And I'm David Day, host for Asian Review on Thursdays. Both of us broadcast our respective shows at 4 p.m.
And my topics tend to deal with questions related to environment, culture, history, and sometimes human rights.
And my shows tend to be on international business, foreign policy, geopolitics, and national security. And you can watch our shows live on the ThinkTech website at thinktechhawaii.com.
And you can also watch us on YouTube or Olalo.
So come join us on Thursdays at 4 p.m. I'm David Day.
And on Tuesdays at 4 p.m., I'm Hong Jiang.
Aloha.
Hello.
Okay, welcome back. Welcome back to Think Talks, Think Tech Talks. I'm Jay Fidell. We're talking about fashion. Fashion goes local in New York, but maybe more, with Elizabeth Cline. She's a reporter for The Nation. She wrote an article and a book about fashion, and we've been talking about the New York scene. I love that. I love to find people like you, Elizabeth. We can talk about the scene. So you mentioned, just before we broke, you mentioned that, that somehow social media was a big part of this. And I was going to ask you, you know, because if you have a reinvigoration of manufacturing connected with technology, connected with design, then it also must be connected with marketing, no? And here we are, starting on this new path, and we just happen to find social media all around us. It's got to fall into place. How is it falling into place?
Man, yeah, that part of it is really tough, because independent fashion designers and people that are kind of working on this alternative model, they're up against these multi-million-dollar, huge corporate fashion brands and high-end luxury designers. They're up against the designers at Fashion Week, you know, who are household names at this point. But that said, you know, I see, for example, there's this this website that I believe launched out of Brooklyn called Helpsy. And it's an ethical fashion, local fashion online retailer. And they did something very clever during Fashion Week last week. They held a pop-up shop, so like a temporary retail store, where you could come in and buy some, you know, of the more well-known locally produced fashion lines that are being made in New York City. And they threw parties, and they made sure that it was covered in a lot of different places. So I do see a certain level of promotion going into this. And I think in New York City a couple years ago, we also had the green shows, and I'm not sure if that's going to be resurrected, but it would be great to see something like that where you have kind of like more alternative fashion weeks happening.
Yeah, pop-up shops, co-working spaces and pop-up shops. We're right at the frontier on that. But it sounds to me like if I'm graduating high school or college in French literature, something unrelated completely, this might appeal to me, and there might be, you know, I might have a career wish on this kind of career. But question, you know, how easy is it to get into the business? New York is always, the big apple on trying to find new opportunities. Is it that way in fashion? Is it just, yearning for new talent, new jobs?
Well, fashion is interesting because compared to a lot of industries, there's a very low barrier to entry. It doesn't take a lot of capital to start a new fashion business. The problem, though, is that fashion schools don't really train designers in business skills. So you have people with really great ideas who don't know how to run a business. They're basically being trained to work for corporate fashion houses and big brands. And that's why organizations like Manufacture New York and the Brooklyn Design and Fashion Accelerator are so instrumental, because they're not only going to provide studio space and access to manufacturing. The third component is mentorship, helping these people these new designers write a business plan, get funding, figure out their merchandising, because sometimes people come in and say, I'm gonna do this high-end line and charge $300 for a jacket. Well, if no one's ever heard of you and you're a new designer, good luck selling a $300 jacket. Mm-hmm. So part of it is helping these people understand, these new designers understand how to run a business. But I do think there is a lot of opportunity in fashion. It is over $1 trillion global industry. So we keep making jokes about people with art and literature degrees, which I know, didn't Obama just put his foot in his mouth making fun of art history majors? But fashion is a huge business, and there is space for more people. There's space for people with good ideas, and particularly for people who have some business sense or an interest in developing those business skills.
Yeah, one of the things occurs to me, we're a digital media company. We like video cameras. We like cameras. We like to make video and images and whatnot. And I'm sure that business has existed in New York for a long time. Excuse me. But, you have all the film schools. Yeah. You have a lot of talented people. You have, fantastic product coming out. And I told you before the show that my niece is a filmmaker out of Brooklyn, maybe near you. And, I'm sure that fashion and video, fashion and photography are joined at the hip. So there must be a secondary effect in that area too, no?
Yeah, absolutely. As fashion businesses grow, they need access to photography studios. As I said, people with merchandising skills, sales skills. And then Fashion Week, just the economic impact of that, of the people that come in for that, and the way that, people who come in for Fashion Week spend money in New York. It certainly creates a ripple effect, and, I think raises the tide for everyone. And that's what we're really hoping to see, is to take these independent designers who want to make clothes in the United States, specifically in New York City, and scale their businesses up. Because once they get on their feet and they become stable businesses, that's when the economy, even outside of fashion, starts to benefit.
So the city recognizes this. You have a city government that actually understands about this and is actually committing American money to help it. What is the city government doing? Is it enough? How do people feel about it? Do they like it or they want more?
Well, so we have a new mayor, Bill de Blasio, and one of his campaign promises was to improve zoning in New York City for industry. As you can imagine, New York City has become very hostile to manufacturing spaces. Mm-hmm. A lot of it has been, a lot of former factory space has been rezoned, turned into condominiums, and really New York real estate always goes to the highest bidder, and that's not going to be a factory in a lot of cases. So it's really important for the city to strengthen zoning regulations so that factories can thrive and survive and stay in one place for decades without worrying that someone's going to come in and convert the property to a condo or an office building. So this new mayor seems to understand this acutely, and he, within the first couple of weeks of his administration, went to the Garment District. He also is working with the city's Economic Development Corporation and the Council of Fashion Designers of America they just announced the winners of a round of funding for factories in New York City who need money to upgrade their machinery and train people. So he also seems to understand that in order for New York City's garment industry to stay competitive, it needs to modernize. So Bill de Blasio has, publicly gotten behind this round of funding, these loans. So I think that more could be done, but I think everyone is also really hopeful about this administration.
Well, it sounds like a laboratory to me, a laboratory that in some ways is beyond the China laboratory, because you can do it faster. You can meet the demand, instantaneously, and you can achieve this tremendous level of creativity. Query, though, with this laboratory, is it catching? Is it catching to San Francisco? Is it catching to Atlanta? Is it catching to Los Angeles? Do you see secondary effect on this? Is the whole country moving in this way, or is it limited to New York?
Definitely not just limited to New York. I mean, you have to remember New York is insanely expensive. Sometimes I can't even believe that there are people trying to manufacture here. But, we're building on a historical garment district base. The ecosystem that we have here is so incredible that it needs to be preserved, and all fashion designers live here. But that said, I'm seeing local fashion hubs in Raleigh, North Carolina, Portland, Oregon, Austin, Texas, Detroit, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago. It is everywhere, and it is so inspiring because, like I said, fashion has a low barrier to entry. Really, if you want to start a local fashion business and you have an idea, all you need to do is buy fabric, get some sewing machines, and
take a look at New York.
learn
from New York.
Have a little savvy when it comes to branding and get your name out there.
We're going to take one more break, Elizabeth, and when we come back, I'd like to tell you what's going on in Honolulu and get your reaction and advice as to how we can join that list of cities. That's Elizabeth Cline. She's a reporter for The Nation. We're talking about fashion goes local, but maybe national, maybe global on Think Tech Talks. We'll be right back.
Aloha. I'm Nicole Horry for Think Tech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
Okay, we're back with Elizabeth Cline, who joins us by Skype from Brooklyn, New York, talking about fashion. Fashion goes local. There may be more here on Think Tech Talks. She's a reporter for The Nation, and we've been talking about all kinds of aspects of the New York laboratory, the New York Renaissance in fashion, but I want to come to Hawaii for a moment and see what advice she can give us. So we have a fashion guild here, not very big, but it exists, and it's existed for 6 or 7 years. We have a fashion month where everybody shows their stuff, and it's been pretty successful. I mean, in the local context anyway. We have fashion awards that are given out by the governor every year. That is something, so he gets involved. We actually very limited, but we have a fashion manufacturing facility. I'm not sure how well they're doing. It's hard to do manufacturing in Hawaii, but there's one neighborhood called Kaka'ako, that I'll spell that for you later, where there's a possibility there's a possibility of actual garment manufacturing. So we used to have this extraordinary textiles, design, and manufacturing industry here when I first came here in the 60s, and it occupied a lot of space, a lot of buildings, even in the center of the city. And it was very popular, and it was joined with the tourism industry. So everybody who came here had to get an aloha shirt, they had to get a muumuu dress and whatnot, and it was going gangbusters for a long time. And it kind of ended, you know, per the history you and I talked about earlier, when Asia got to make the same things, and there was nothing particularly creative, and Asia could manufacture it cheaper, and this industry here mostly went away. And now we have at least the possibility of a renaissance, kind of, relative to us anyway, kind of like what you have. You didn't list it on the cities you mentioned. Maybe you meant to list it, but it exists in a very, you know, very small crucible. And I'm wondering if you have any reactions or any advice for us in the remaining minutes of the show about how we can do what New York is doing, how we can click into New York or emulate New York.
I think you're going to have to invite me to Honolulu for me to answer that question. No, I wanted to ask why you were saying that it's difficult to manufacture anything there. What are the barriers?
Cost of land and cost of labor. Land. Yeah, labor and land are both very hard, and you know, this is great pressure, and you know, it's going to be more expensive than it is overseas.
Well, I mean, what New York City has done that could be applicable to Hawaii is because you do have a tourism industry, and you have, I think, in some sectors, a high-end tourism industry. I think it could support higher-end clothing being made there. The other thing is, I can't believe that there's not a factory producing locally produced aloha shirts. Is that true?
Well, there's one, but I think it's hanging on rather than, you know, prosperous. And I think most of the aloha wear, if you will, that's been manufactured in the past few decades has been in Asia. That's just the way it is. And there might be one, but I think mostly it's from elsewhere. Not to say that this can't happen. Not to say that the kind of renaissance you're experiencing in New York can't happen here. It's just that, you know, entrepreneurship doesn't come easy.
No, I think that, you know, I would have to know more about the situation, but I think that, you know, as long as the city's behind protecting manufacturing space, like we were talking earlier, providing tax breaks and funding for people interested in keeping industry in Hawaii and in Honolulu, as well as supporting small business owners. That's the other key piece of this. You know, a lot of new fashion designers have trouble getting loans. Well, if someone came to you know, this city and said, I want to start a fashion business, I'm going to do all my production in Hawaii, there should be some sort of incentive available for them. And then from there, there needs to be you know, a PR campaign, a push. There needs to be people in the community who say, we want to support local, we want to buy made in Hawaii. I mean, that's what's happening in New York. Is it's become a badge of honor to wear something made in the city.
Absolutely.
And I think that can happen anywhere, and it is happening everywhere.
Well, it strikes me too that what's going on in New York is special, and it is the leader. I mean, I'm from New York. Could you tell that? Way back when.
Just a little bit.
And, you know, I mean, I really have a lot of loyalty to the city, especially now, especially in, you know, in these days of Renaissance. And I'm thinking that one good thing for somebody who's trying to do a fashion industry here could be, you say you like to come here and see what's going on. Well, I think they should go there also and see what's going on. They should come and find you, Elizabeth. They should talk to you. They should get some advice, and that would help them. Then I'm going to personally, if you don't mind, I'm going to give, you know, Melissa White, who is the leader of the fashion industry here, and a friend of mine, I'm going to give her your name and see if she can't learn from you. But I think if we connect the cities, you know, sister city, if you will, we can really make some hay here, because we do have the market. We have a global tourist market in which fashion, just as it is in New York, is really important to the tourist in the way of occupying his time.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, I'm part of something that we call the Sustainable Fashion Brain Trust in New York. And I spend a lot of my time traveling and talking to people about what they can do locally to support fashion manufacturing. You know, I've been to Portland, Oregon, for example, to talk to people there. I just got back from a city in Georgia. So I think you're right. It's about cross-pollination between cities and sharing ideas to make sure that this isn't specific to New York City, that that the movement just continues to spread.
I can see it now. I can see the muumuus and the aloha shirts all over 38th Street. I can see that. Elizabeth Cline, reporter for The Nation. I really have enjoyed talking with you today. This is Think Tech Talks. Fashion goes local, but maybe national. Thank you, Elizabeth, and I'd like to have a conversation again with you, and I will send Melissa White your contact. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's great being on the show.
Aloha.